What happens when an empire falls, but its spirit refuses to die? In the early dawn of December 1902, a dry wind whispered through the savannas of northern Nigeria, rustling the coarse grasses around the rocky escarpments of the Bauchi Plateau. Beneath that whisper was something else, a pulse, steady and tense, like war drums sounding beneath the surface of the earth for the people of Bauchi. The air was thick not just with harmattan dust but with a sense of reckoning. Colonial British forces believed they had already conquered the north. What they didn't know was that something fierce was about to rise, a rebellion they never saw coming. The Bauchi Revolt of 1902 wasn't the largest, nor the bloodiest of uprisings in West African colonial history, but it was something deeper, a cultural and spiritual stand, a quiet resistance that grew from a sacred mountain. A defiant emir and a people who refused to be erased. To understand the events that unfolded in Bauchi, we must first step back into the embers of a collapsing caliphate. By the late 19th century, northern Nigeria was part of a vast Islamic empire known as the Sokoto Caliphate, founded in 1804 by the Fulani scholar and mystic Usman Dan Fodio. It was a theocratic state that stretched from modern-day Niger to Cameroon. At its peak, it held dozens of emirates, including the Emirate of Bauchi, formed under the leadership of Yakubu in the early 1800s. It was a center of Islamic learning and house of Fulani culture, a network of traditional rule bound by faith, scholarship, and trade. But across the seas, a different empire had its eyes set on West Africa. Following the Berlin Conference of 1884, Britain intensified its scramble for territory. By 1900, the Royal Niger Company had ceded its control of the region to the British Crown, and Frederick Lugard was appointed High Commissioner of the newly formed Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. Lugard came with a vision, a policy he would later call indirect rule. On paper, it sounded cooperative. Local emirs would retain their titles, and traditional institutions would be preserved, so long as they served the interests of the British. But the reality was different. Emirs who resisted were swiftly removed or replaced. Those who cooperated often did so under duress, one of the earliest and most dramatic confrontations came at the Sokoto Caliphate's spiritual heart. In 1903, Lugard's forces captured the city of Sokoto, effectively ending the caliphate as a political force. But the conquest did not begin there. It began in Bauchi, months earlier, where the seeds of resistance had already begun to grow. At the center of the Bauchi Revolt stood a man named Muhammadu Ma'aji, a spiritual leader and commander little remembered today, yet deeply feared by British agents of the time, known locally as Gwaska. Ma'aji was not a traditional emir. He was a scholar warrior, aligned with the Tijaniya Sufi order, and deeply opposed to colonial imposition. Bauchi had been under increasing pressure since the British occupation of Zaria and Kano. In 1902, Lugard dispatched Major Burden and a detachment of troops to pacify Bauchi, a euphemism, common in colonial parlance, for forced subjugation. On paper, the mission was to enforce British protection. In practice, it meant the occupation of the town, the hoisting of the Union Jack over the emir's palace, and the extraction of tribute in the form of grain, cattle, and labor. But Bauchi was not like the others. It had a unique geography, nestled in the shadow of the highlands, with narrow passes and hidden sanctuaries. And it had something else, the mountain called Gwana, rising like a jagged tooth from the earth. Gwana was more than terrain, it was sacred ground. For centuries, it had served as a place of retreat and resistance, from pre-Islamic cults to Fulani wars. When Ma'aji saw the British approaching, he did not flee, he withdrew to Gwana, gathering a coalition of fighters, not just Fulani or Hausa, but Sayawa, Tangali, and others, peoples who had their own reasons to resist. These were not mere rebels. They were farmers, traders, clerics, warriors bound together by a shared truth. They did not consent to foreign rule. On December 14, 1902, the silence of the Bauchi Plateau was shattered. British troops, led by Burden, marched toward Gwana, expecting minor skirmishes. Instead, they were ambushed in the narrow valleys beneath the mountain. Arrows, spears, and occasional muskets rained down from the cliffs. The attackers knew the land. The colonials did not. Reports from the time buried in the archives of the British Colonial Office describe confusion, disorder, and fear. One officer wrote, "We were met not by savages, but by ghosts. They came from the mist. They disappeared into rock." Though the British eventually regrouped and brought in reinforcements, the resistance held for several weeks longer than many had expected. Ma'aji, it is said, carried a Quran wrapped in leather on his chest. He preached that to submit to unbelieving rule was a sin. Oral tradition claims he prophesied the fall of the colonizers not in his lifetime but in time. The fighting reached its peak in early January 1903. Unable to dislodge the fighters from Gwana directly, the British turned to their preferred method: siege and starvation. Villages around the mountain were burned, wells were poisoned, crops were seized, and slowly the resistance began to falter. On January 21st, British troops stormed the final stronghold. Ma'aji was captured or perhaps killed. The records are unclear. Some say he died in battle. Others say he escaped and disappeared into the hills. His body was never found. His grave, if it exists, has never been identified. The British declared victory. Bauchi was pacified, but something odd happened in the years that followed. Unlike other conquered emirates, Bauchi never fully embraced indirect rule. Its emirs remained cautious, its people uneasy. British officers complained that tax collection remained inconsistent. Local clerics refused to collaborate. Resistance simmered quiet, but ever present. One young colonial officer stationed in Bauchi in 1910 wrote in his diary, "There is something in these hills that will not bow. It sleeps with one eye open." The Bauchi Revolt was never commemorated with statues or parades. It's not found in most Nigerian schoolbooks, and it rarely appears in Western accounts of colonial conquest. But its spirit endures in oral histories, in poems sung in Sayawa and Fulfulde, and in the eyes of elders who still remember stories of the mountain called Gwana. In 1992, a documentary by the Nigerian Television Authority briefly touched on the revolt in a special called The Voices of the Plateau, though much of the footage has since been lost. The historian Mahmud Modibbo Tukur, in his seminal work The Imposition of British Colonial Rule on Northern Nigeria, alluded to the uprising as one of the earliest and most organized expressions of anti-colonial resistance in the region. What makes the Bauchi Revolt so haunting is not its scale, but its silence, how quickly it was buried, how intentionally it was forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing. Just as Gwana stands firm against wind and time, the memory of those who fought not for victory, but for dignity, refuses to vanish. And here lies the final twist. In 1947, as Nigeria's push for independence began to rise, local politicians from Bauchi invoked the names of Ma'aji and his fighters in speeches, quiet nods to a struggle that had begun half a century earlier. The British, they said, had conquered the land but never the soul. But what happened to Ma'aji? Was he a myth shaped by collective memory, or a real man who vanished into legend? And why has Gwana Mountain remained such a potent symbol, even today, with strange lights and whispered sightings reported by hikers and villagers? In a future episode, we'll explore the secret sanctuaries of Gwana and the role of mountains in African resistance culture, from the caves of Ethiopia to the heights of Lesotho. For now, remember, not all rebellions are loud. Some live in silence, some grow in the shadow of mountains. If this story made you see history in a new light, if it made you feel the dust of the plateau and hear the whispers of the past, then help us keep these voices alive. Like this video, subscribe to History Off the Map, and tell us in the comments what stories from your region still wait to be told. Because history isn't always written in books. Sometimes it's carved into the earth,